Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started. So this week, as is often the case, I think when topics can come out of current work that we're doing, I feel like we tend to get the best topics. And this week's topic, I think, comes from work I'm doing currently in my app Sleep++, which is a sleep tracker, where I'm working on doing automatic sleep detection and sleep analysis, which is a feature that I've long been asked for by my users, but I've hadn't quite gotten to. And so for the last week or so, this is what I've been working on, and the process so far has been pretty promising that this is something that I'm going to be able to do. But I think there's an interesting topic and a broader thing to talk about in just sort of generally talking about things that are kind of feel like original research or primary research, you could call it. So often when we're developing something, when we're making an app or a product, there's much of it that is not new or novel in any real sense. If you're, the process of taking data, putting it in a database, taking that data out, putting it in a table view, like that, there's nothing original and special there. But often if you want to have something, an app that's really compelling or has an interesting hook to it, you're going to have to do things that are beyond that. And so in many ways, you end up kind of doing this kind of research. You're kind of inventing something in a real sense of the word invention. And not every app has to have this, certainly, but it is something that I've found that is good to have in your toolbox as something that you're not scared to try. That if you have an idea about, I wonder if I could do this kind of, usually there's some kind of processing involved. Maybe it's image processing. You're working on a camera app and you want to do some kind of image filters, or an audio app and maybe you're doing some audio processing. Or in my case, I'm analyzing users' movement and heart rate and that kind of thing. There's usually some kind of processing involved, and doing this kind of research, I think, gives your app an advantage, both in terms of it being more useful to your customers, which is probably far more important. That, my goal with doing automatic sleep detection is that more people will track their sleep more often, because they won't have to remember to start and stop the motion tracking like they do currently. It'll just happen automatically, which sounds great. But it also creates this nice little sort of competitive advantage that there's now this little moat around your app that anybody who wants to compete feature by feature with you now has to go through and build it themselves. They have to do that research. They have to work out how to do it. And fair enough, it's easier the second time. Somebody looking at what you have done, even if they'd never see your code or understand your methodology, simply knowing that a solution exists with a given set of inputs is, a tremendous advantage versus the number of times that I've gone down a road where I'm like, I wonder if I could, and then I spend a week and I work on something and it doesn't work out, and so I give up, and that never sees the light of day. It's easier knowing that a solution does exist, but it's still a competitive advantage. It's still a road that they have to go down and work that they have to do. So it's an advantage in that regard. And as I was working on my stuff, I was thinking about you, Marco, and how Voice Boost and Smart Speed are two kind of similar types of things that weren't necessarily like your app was the first one to ever do them, but the way that you've done them and the work that you did to add those to your app is now this competitive advantage that you can sort of hold over your competitors.
Yeah, I mean, I've said before that I think kind of a recipe for a pretty good, useful app that is kind of a good balance between diving in and spending a whole bunch of time on hard stuff nobody will ever notice versus being really basic and having no competitive advantage and having no compelling features. I think a really good balance between those two is do like one or two hard things in your app, and everything else doesn't need to be like a hard, impressive technical thing. But if you have like one or two, that can really make an app. And, for Instapaper, originally that was the text parser. And then later on, I did like some Kindle stuff that was a little bit crazy and like, weird like things with pagination on the iPhone. But that was a relatively small number of features. Ultimately, the great value of that app was pretty boring stuff. And then, the text parser was like the big one. And for Overcast, yeah, I think Smart Speed and Voice Boost are pretty significant features that are, that are hard and require some deep learning or not deep learning, require like some deep knowledge of low-level audio manipulation and audio mastering and stuff like that to really do that well. And I had to learn a lot of that stuff, and it was hard. I happen to like that kind of hard work, so it was fun for me, and it still is fun whenever I work on it today. But that was really hard stuff. I had to learn mostly by like Google searches and trial and error of things like DSP audio processing, like how to do that and what I'm actually manipulating with the audio signals and how not to do it and all the different ways to do it that make it sound crappy. So I can avoid those ways and eventually figuring out ways to do it that sound good or that can't be noticed. That is all really hard work, but I've always enjoyed like that kind of like low level data work. Not necessarily in the sense of like big data, but like just like working in low level C functions on in performance critical like large blocks of numbers and operations, using things like the accelerate functions in iOS. Like I always like that stuff. But if I spent all of my time doing that in Overcast, I would be unbalanced. Like, right now, like I'm kind of battling with my self-discipline. What I really want to be working on a lot of the time is the work I'm doing for Voice Boost 2, which is just regular Voice Boost, but just going to sound better and work better with more stuff. And that's all this wonderful, like low-level stuff, making my own audio processing functions and everything. And it's going to be it's exactly this kind of thing. But what my customers actually want is not for me to make Voice Boost 2 for the most part. What my customers really want is boring stuff. Like everybody wants me to give them like a smart playlist that shows all their starred items. That's a really boring thing that I need to do because that's what they actually want. Most of the app is boring stuff like that, like download management and, basic, UI for things. I still don't have a way for people to change their email address on their account because it's like, stuff like that. That's what people actually want. So it's important when you're doing like these kind of like cool, fun, like low-level math type features or data analysis type features, it's important to make sure you also keep that balance, though, of not spending too much of your time on it. And as much as this is kind of cynical, but not wasting too much time on stuff that's really hard to market to people. Like one of the reasons why a lot of people assume that Overcast invented silent skipping and dynamic processing on podcasts is because I was the first one to figure out how to market those features to people. And that isn't just like, dumping money into ads. I didn't actually ever really do that. Like not until very recently have I tried that. Marketing that, this kind of feature is about making sure people know it's there and telling them why it's so good in some way. And so for these features, like I gave them names that were not just like, plain text descriptions. I didn't say like shorten silences, and I didn't say boost the volume or use a dynamics compressor. Like I didn't name those features those things. I gave them branded names. I trademarked those names. I put those names on everything. I added features like it showed you how much time you had saved with the silence skipper feature, because I need to show people that this feature that when it's turned on, they don't really notice, is doing something for them. And all of that was to help market these features that I spent a lot of time on, this low-level fun stuff, because otherwise nobody would know they were there, and the few people who would find them and turn them on wouldn't really understand how good they are, because they're both kind of like subtle effects most of the time. And so they both kind of like, they help you out in a subtle way. But if you don't know that, if you're not being shown or told that in some compelling way, then a lot of that effort is wasted. And so it's very important when you're planning these kind of features to make sure that A, you're not spending too much time on them to the exclusion of features that people actually need or want more. And B, that you're not going to invest a ton of time into something like this that is unmarketable in some way. Like you have to include in your planning for features like this how you're going to communicate the existence and the value of these features to your customers.
Yeah, and I think what's cool is that once you've done that, like if you work out a way to communicate to your customer that you do this, you do some hard work, you can find a way to communicate that to your customer. You end up with something that is really compelling in a weirdly insidious way that like I feel bad if I listen to podcast type audio, like long form audio, without the silences removed now. Because in my back of my mind, I feel like I'm wasting time. And so like that is a hook that you now have like placed in me that if I listen to something long form, I will find a way to turn that into something that I can listen to with something like SmartSpeed. Just because that's what I expect. Because you've wrapped up this kind of original, like it's not original in the sense that you were the first person to come up with it, but original in the sense that you had to do a lot of hard, low-level work to make it happen. You're not just building. It's not just like AV. You're not just doing, AV player dot, remove silences equal true. Like if that was the case, then,
I wish it was that easy.
like that would be great, right? But that's not the case. You had to do all of this whole cloth development to make it work, and that now you have this great little advantage that. One of the things that keeps me in Overcast rather than another podcast player is that I don't want to lose this thing that I now have. And so it's this little moat that other people could certainly build it. It's not like it's technically crazy to build SmartSpeed or to build Voice Boost, but it's building an app in general is difficult, and then tackling one of these features, is also kind of hard. So it's just this nice little. It's undertaking one of these. I think you're definitely right, though. Be careful that you're like taking on something that you can show. You have something to show for at the end. But if you do, and it does make sense, like it's a wonderful little. It's a wonderful way to create value that is hard, is defensible rather than easily copied by somebody else.
But it's important to also realize that like nothing is going to be yours forever. Like Overcast was the only mass market podcast player that had these features for a while, but now it isn't. And and it never really was the absolute only one, but it was the only like really mass market one. And now it's not. And more of them are going to keep adding features like this. Like I had a couple good years there. It bought me some time, similar to like Apple with the iPhone launch, like the original iPhone. Steve famously said that it was 5 years ahead of the competition, and that basically proved to be true. That was roughly correct. Like it took Android a long time to reach like the minimum quality that the iPhone had, years earlier. And so it buys you some time when you have something like this, but not necessarily tons of time, and it's definitely a limited amount. Like it will end, and so. It's important not to rest on your laurels and not to assume that something cool you do is going to be yours forever. So maybe that's doing cooler things. Maybe that's finding other ways to remain competitive, in the future. But keep in mind that when you're deciding what to do, when you're planning out your app, when you are trying to allocate time, keep in mind again the value of these features will not last forever. So let that inform how much time that you allocate to them. Anyway, we are brought to you this week by Squarespace. Enter offer code RADAR at checkout to get 10% off your first purchase. Make your next move with Squarespace. Squarespace lets you easily create a website for your next idea with a unique domain, award-winning templates, and much more. Whether you want to create an online store or a portfolio site or a blog or even a podcast, Squarespace is an all-in-one platform that lets you do any of those things or all of those things. There's nothing to install, no patches or updates to worry about, no upgrades to do. You don't have to worry about any of that stuff because Squarespace has it covered. And if there's anything that you need help with or if anything goes wrong, they have award-winning 24/7 customer support if you need any help. They let you quickly and easily grab a unique domain name when you're getting started, and all of these award-winning templates they have are beautifully designed for you to show off your great ideas, and you can customize the template to your heart's content, really make it yours. Squarespace plans start at just $12 a month, and you can start a free trial with no credit card required by going to squarespace.com. When you sign up, make sure to use the offer code RADAR to get 10% off your first purchase and to show your support for Under the Radar. We thank Squarespace for their support. Squarespace, make your next move, make your next website.
So now that you've decided that you're going to go down the road of doing some kind of an original research project to like add a new feature to your app, I was thinking, how do you? It's like there's lots of different approaches I think you can take to something like that. And one thing that I wanted to start off talking about is how when I do these types of things, I always take a very, I guess you'd call it the empirical approach rather than the theoretical approach. That I try and just, I get in there and I just start to build things. I try a lot of things and just experiment. I just try and generate a lot of data as best I can, and then run test cases through my system, whatever it may be. Because I find that I'm just not very academic, and I used to, I think, earlier in my career, be intimidated by the fact that I just wasn't particularly academic in that way, that I'm not coming at it from a theoretical approach that I'm then trying to work out how to implement. In many ways, I start with implementations. I start with just like, well, let me see if this works. Well, let me see if this works. And in theory, a theoretical approach would help you get to the right solution more directly, or at least in a more straightforward way. But I would encourage anybody who's slightly intimidated by the feeling that, oh man, it's like this needs to be super theoretical. It's like maybe, depending on what you're working on, but often a more direct empirical, just like kind of do your best approach will often get there. And in my experience, gets you there well enough, and can, allow you to create these features without needing a lot of theoretical knowledge, without a lot of deep and potentially like the deep understanding. You may not understand exactly why, a particular method is working, but it can work for you. And, you could argue whether that's good or not, but I found it to work well. So, just an encouragement is don't be too scared of things if you can just sort of approach them more directly.
Yeah, I too am pretty weak on the academic side. I'm especially weak in the advanced math, really, like things like calculus. I really never took, or well, I took it but failed it. Most of the advanced like linear algebra stuff, I have a very, very weak understanding of. Really, almost all advanced math, I really just either never took in college and just never learned it afterwards, or I took it and took it so poorly that I really just know nothing about it. So whenever I'm like looking up online, looking up some kind of algorithm, and I start to see the mathematic notation, I'm just like, oh crap, I'm probably not going to figure this out. And sometimes I try and plow through, and the simpler ones I can kind of work out like the pseudocode of how to do in my language that I know what they are trying to tell me how to do. But like, once something comes to like, oh, you have to read these academic papers to understand how to do this algorithm or something, that's usually when I bail out, because I try sometimes, but I can't usually get through them. And so what I do with a lot of my approaches to like these hard, math or data problems is really fairly simple things. Like I'm pretty good at coming up with, just off the top of my head, coming up with some kind of heuristic of like, oh, maybe if I, look for this pattern and I give it this some kind of like weight in a scoring, algorithm, that maybe this will be better. And sometimes that works. Most of the time it doesn't, but occasionally I get something out of it that is pretty useful. And that's how I tend to do these kind of things. It's basically like trial and error to develop some kind of heuristic or algorithm that is really not a very mathematically advanced algorithm. It's really just like, large amounts of dumb math, large amounts of like basic arithmetic. That I can do, but you don't need necessarily an advanced knowledge of sophisticated math and the more advanced stuff. That being said, I do think my lack of knowledge there holds me back to some degree. Like there's a lot of statistical methods, things like especially when dealing with things like large data sets, dealing with things like data clustering and statistical analysis of large pools of data. I basically don't understand any of that. And that is holding me back to some degree. So I do want to get better at some of that stuff, but ultimately you don't necessarily need to if you can't or don't want to. Like you can get pretty far without the knowledge of some of that advanced math stuff.
Yeah, and the thing that's key there is that your solution may not be optimal, but you may get a solution. It's sort of, in a weird way, it makes me think of how, like, if you didn't understand what multiplication was, but you knew how to do addition, you could still end up with the same result.
You're by just a for loop that just adds it a bunch of times.
Sure, right. Like, which is obviously kind of like a trivial example of this, but that is often, I think, the impression that I have is that often my approach is repeated addition rather than multiplication because I don't understand the higher concept. But you don't get I still end up with 20 with 4 times 5. I just may, even the fact that I add 5 to itself 4 times versus just being able to do it directly with multiplication, that's less efficient, but the answer is the same. It's still 20.
And like computers are so fast, even on our phones and our watches, like microprocessors these days are just so ridiculously fast that for a lot of problems like this, even if you just have kind of like a brute force solution, or even if it's like an imprecise solution, that is probably both fast enough and good enough for a lot of times.
Yeah. And so, it's which is an encouragement that it's like, yeah, it's like it's okay. And that's fine. And it's, as with a lot of these kind of discussions, you can get into like, is it certainly better? Or is it more efficient to have a more theoretical approach or fundamental understanding? Of course. But, if in order to gain that level of understanding, you almost certainly have to be, spend a lot more time, and like to become an expert in that area is going to take a lot of time and be a lot of distractions away from other things. So it may not be worth getting that level of understanding. So just worth keeping in mind.
Yeah, definitely.
In terms of the actual building of these things, I think it seemed worth actually sort of diving into the approach that I've taken. Like I'll talk to my recent example with automatic sleep tracking, where I'm going to add this to an app. My usual approach is to create a completely separate app. I've tried, and then eventually it'll end up being a branch in the main app, but usually I just create a completely new app that has none of the overhead, none of the other things going on. And mostly I do that because then I can just kind of, if I go down a bad line of thinking and it just ends up in a dead end, I can just throw it away and start again. And it's easier, I find, for me to just kind of have the super focused, lightweight app. I don't need to go to a particular place in the app. Like often I end up doing stuff just in the viewed and finished launching. Like it's basically a command line app just running on an iPhone. Like you end up doing that kind of thing where you make it as quick and as simple as possible, and it's focused in on exactly what the problem is. I find that to be a very helpful approach. I tend to do my work there to validate that that something is possible, and then I'll start to work on how will I take that and turn it into the final version. And that first version, I have no consideration at all to code quality. Often I will completely throw that code away. I will just repeat, I will end up re-implementing it, just using all the lessons I learned from all of that throwaway code. But by taking such a quick and dirty approach to it, it means that I can work much more quickly and iterate on it, that I don't need to feel like, I'm writing code that is going to end up needing to be production quality. I can ignore all the errors. I can just sort of make it so that it just works on exactly what I'm trying to do. And so in this case, I had built a separate app that, tried to automatically detect and analyze, sleep data out of all the various health inputs that we have. And I just sat there and iterated on that until I got it to work. And then now I'm going through the process of actually, turning that understanding and the data that I can get out of that, completely re-implemented from scratch, that all those algorithms and methods that I came up with. Again, in this case, it was actually slightly amusing because I built my prototype app in Swift, and then my Swift C++ is an Objective-C app, and so I was going to re-implement it anyway, and it actually kind of worked well to keep me from being lazy and just copy pasting things. That I actually went through and had to be thoughtful in that translation from the prototype app to the actual app to make sure that I'm actually taking care of all the edge cases and things. But that's an approach that I find works pretty well. And then once you can get it into the app, then you can actually start working through the actual, making it of a higher quality. But I find, doing it as developing and prototyping in a separate app, and then moving in once you kind of have the basics worked out, works pretty well for me.
So I'm curious, because I think it goes back to our competitive advantage argument earlier. Why are you adding this feature?
Mostly because I think it makes the app better, and I wish I did it. And I know I often hear from people who use my competitor's app because they do it, and it turned out to be much easier than I thought it was going to be. I had in my mind that it was going to be really hard, and so I'd been putting off working on it. And because I have a lot of existing sleep data calculated my old method, I was able to much more quickly, I think, work out a way to process all this data and end up with very similar results, because I could just kind of try lots of things and I could very quickly see if it worked or wasn't going to work. And I think it's a competitive advantage, and I know it's a feature that I will use myself. The ability to have your Apple Watch just track your sleep without, all you have to do is wear it while you sleep, and then it's all taken care of. And so I think it's an advantage in that regard, because you'll actually use the app more. Because right now you have to remember to use it, which is always difficult.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. Like that obviously is a compelling feature, and I've heard podcasts where people talk about how they're comparing your app to one of the competitors that does automatic stuff, and I thought, oh, that sounds compelling, but I too would have assumed that was really hard, and that's also kind of another, I think maybe a good closing note here is like a lot of the, like, if you're a developer and you think of or you see some other app that or you think of a feature that you want to do that sounds really hard or impossible, try it, because it might not be. Like I first thought that that doing pagination in Instapaper would be really hard, and it turned out it really wasn't. Similar, like if you think like, oh, I would love to do this kind of analysis on some feature with data, but the iPhone probably can't handle it. It's probably like too computationally intensive. Try it, because it might not be. That's another area where I've found, like, I always assume that, oh, maybe I probably can't do things like run a live FFT on the audio stream without having a big battery impact. And the answer a lot of times is, nope, you totally can. It's totally fine. Like, these devices are really fast these days.
Yeah, and it's just kind of a nice thing to be, like, there is something just really fun and encouraging when you hit on something that you thought would be really hard that actually turned out to not be crazy hard. And like, that was a really fun thing. And it speaks to, actually, the last thing that I want to mention too is I've found tremendously valuable, as quickly as I can, working out how to visualize the problem that I'm working on in a way that I can see, rather than just like data that's being NS logged out to the console.
That's a good tip.
So in a lot of my apps, like in this case with sleep tracking, there's a lot. It's very timeline based. I'm looking at a variety of inputs over time, and so I just have a really simple app or a view controller that just has a scroll view in it, and all of the data points that I have on it, I just create a UI view and I throw it into it, which is horrifically unperformant. I have like 10,000 UI views in one scroll view, but it's fine.
That's
like,
awesome.
There's better ways to do graphing, and like actually doing pagination and stuff. So I'm only rendering the stuff that I need to, but like, it's fine. It's in this prototype app, but visualizing it, making it so that I can see the connections. And like in this case, it was, I ended up visualizing the outputs of my first couple of attempts and aligning them with the outputs of my previous method, and they lined up perfectly. And I was like, well, this works. Well, that's amazing. And so visualizing that as quickly as you can is just something that I can't emphasize enough. That, and I know this is something I think I saw you were talking about with your Voice Boost 2 stuff. You do the same thing, but like as soon as you can see it, it's both motivating in terms of encouraging you that you're on the right track, as well as very quickly showing you the areas that aren't working and the things you need to change.
Exactly, it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, but anyway, so go forth, do some original research, try and not be intimidated by things that you think are too hard, and see what you can come up with. Because I think if you can come up with these things, like, and it turns out that they're easier than you thought, maybe, like you can create, it creates a tremendous value in your app that I think, especially if you, as a smaller team or as a smaller developer, there is a tremendous advantage to having these little things that are hooks, that are marketing lines, that are reasons why someone might want to try your app versus something else.
Thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll talk to you next week.
Bye.